Great. So welcome, everyone. My name's Joss Colchester. I'm with the SI London Hub team, and this evening I'm going to be your host, your coach, your facilitator for this workshop, exploring the systems thinking canvas. And we'll be here for about 1 hour this evening. Today's event is being live streamed, so recorded for those who can't make it. I have my co-host Manali, part of our London team, also with us here. She's going to be taking comments in the chat. So if you have any questions, anything you'd like to share, post them in the chat there as we go along, and she'll pick up anything we need to discuss. We will be working on a Miro board today. Hopefully you're familiar with Miro. Manali is going to share in the chat the link for you to join when you're ready. So just to give a little overview to what we'll be covering. Firstly, the resources that we'll be looking at. We have here the guide. So today we'll just be doing a workshop, right? We'll be working on this board here on Miro and going through the different stages in this canvas. So today is a workshop. We won't be giving long presentations or exploring ideas or anything like this. We'll be learning how to use this canvas, and that's the aim of today's workshop. But if you're not super familiar with the ideas, then you can use this guide here, which is what this canvas is based upon. So when you're on the Miro board, you just click on it, and this little link here should pop up, and you click on that, and it'll take you to the page where you can download the PDF for future reading about all these ideas. This one here is the actual canvas we'll be using. Again, you just click on it, and you'll find there a link to the source. So you'll be able to download that and use it as you see fit. So that's what we'll be covering. And I'd say today's, in thinking about it, I think today's session is particularly relevant, or this canvas is particularly useful for researchers, teachers, and I'd say design and innovators, maybe for other people also, but these are original kind of use cases I thought of. For researchers, we have many researchers in our community researching many different topics, and they're obviously interested in how do they think about that in a systems way. And this canvas could be a very good, very useful in that context to take the topic that you're researching. It might be cities, it might be organizations, it might be, not sure, water systems or something, and to try and shift your thinking from a kind of a reductionist, partial view to a more holistic view of it, and kind of derive new insight and new ideas and research from that. For teachers, it can be very useful for teaching their students, particularly younger children, about systems thinking and get them to play with these ideas. For designers and innovators, very useful to take their problem and start to think about it in a new, kind of more holistic way. So that would be particularly relevant for them, but also for other people. Okay, so what is this canvas? Let's take a look at that. This is the systems thinking canvas. As I said, it's based upon that guide that you saw there, which is really based upon our quite large knowledge base on our website of systems thinking ideas that we've been teaching for many years. So it kind of draws upon that, and it breaks it down into kind of 4 key areas as we'll be looking at here. It's saying that there are a number of core concepts or core ideas in systems thinking, and we can kind of contrast those with a more reductionist, analytical view of the world. So hopefully you're familiar somewhat with what systems thinking is. It's this holistic way of looking at the world, and obviously in contrast to a more analytical reductionist approach. So what we're doing here is saying, for each of these dimensions, we can look at the world in a kind of reductionist, analytical way, or we can look at it in a kind of holistic way, because these are paradigms, right? They're ways of looking at the world. And we're going to think firstly about what does it look like from a kind of analytical approach, where we're looking at the parts, and then try and shift that and ask the question, what does it look like from this more holistic perspective? And we're going to do that along a number of different dimensions. As we can see in the top left here, it's the initial question of what does it look like to look at this system in a partial kind of piecemeal way, to look at the parts. And then what does it look like to actually start to see the relationships in the whole system we're dealing with here? We'll delve into all of these as we go through. It's what we'll be doing today. We'll be posting up on the board here. The second bit will be around thinking about reductionism and emergence. Maybe you've heard this idea of emergence. Again, it's a very core concept in systems thinking. It's a way of looking at the world. And we'll, again, look at those two contrasts, those two kind of paradigms there to start to explore whatever we're looking at. We'll take some subject matter as we go through as a case to think about what does it look like in a reductionist way of looking at that or an emergent way. Down here, we'll think about the difference between a disconnected view of the world and a more interconnected, networked, relational kind of paradigm. So these are all different dimensions to systems thinking, and we're just kind of using a lens here to look at the world in two different ways, and in so doing, learn how to try and shift our thinking to the systems paradigm. Finally, we'll talk about linear and non-linear, right? What does it mean to look at this system in a kind of cause and effect linear way, as opposed to over here, systems thinking is about feedback loops and non-linear dynamics. So we'll look at that. Okay, any quick questions before we start? Is everybody happy? Are we all on the same page? Have we managed to join the mirror board? Have we found where we are? Everybody happy? Everybody know how to use a mirror board? We're just going to be posting up stickies. So we grab a sticky on the left-hand side here and we put it down. Yep.
Can you resend the link in the chat for the mirror board? Thank you.
Yeah,
yep. Great. Okay, you just put your sticky down. I'll get you now in 1 minute to do this. And of course, you just type away like that. It'll be as simple as that today. So let's stay going and look at our first board here. I'll just lock these down. So, okay. So here's the first one. And we're going to take as subject matter, it's something we're looking at, right, out there in the world. Remember, this systems thinking, it's a paradigm, and so is reductionism a paradigm. That means it's a way of looking at the world. It's a way of framing and contextualizing things and deriving knowledge about things. And we're going to take education, the education system, as the thing we're looking at here. And then we're going to ask, there's two different ways of looking at that, right? There's this analytical way, which is kind of a piecemeal way. We look at the individual parts. And then there's a holistic way. And we're going to, we're going to actually use this canvas. I'm going to invite you to post up the question of what does it look like from either of these perspectives, so that you use this and get an idea of what it's actually like. So maybe I'll say a little bit about holism. Hopefully you're familiar with this. Holism refers to any approach that emphasizes the whole rather than the individual parts of a system. Holistic accounts of the world look at how an entity forms part of some larger whole and is defined by its relations and functioning within that broader system. What all holistic approaches have in common includes the principle that the whole has priority over its parts and the assumption that the properties of the parts can't be explained by the properties, or the whole can't be explained by the properties of its parts alone. That actually the whole is kind of an emergent phenomenon, as we'll talk about. Within this paradigm, the ultimate source of knowledge can be seen to derive from, not from the elementary parts. We don't describe the whole by how all the individual parts work and add up, instead with reference to the whole system and its broader environment. So for example, the wetness of water only emerges when two atoms, hydrogen and oxygen, are combined to give water. So something emerges as a whole system. In such a context, it requires that we look at the system as a whole to understand the properties, those emergent properties. So that's the idea. And I'd like you to join me here in this first little exercise. We're thinking about education and education systems. What does that look, what does it mean? What does that system look like when we look at it in this piecemeal way? Individual parts. And then we'll go over here. So let's just take maybe 2 minutes or so to post up some ideas here. If you could please keep the stickies relatively small so that we can all fit our ideas in here. And yeah, try to describe what does it look like to look at the system in a piecemeal way. Okay, we'll just take 1 or 2 more minutes, but for those who have just joined, to refresh what we're doing here, we're on the first section of this 4-section canvas. We are thinking about education, or we're looking at education, and we're looking at it through a reductionist kind of piecemeal view of the world, a partial view of the world, where we look at the individual parts. And we're asking, through that lens, what does this system look like when we look at it in that way? We'll just take one more minute to do that. Okay, let's take a look at some of this, what we've got here. It's not super easy, you know, to flick between paradigms, worldviews, but it's a very good exercise if you want to learn what we're talking about in systems thinking. And you know, one of the best ways to learn something is to contrast it with something else, and that's what we're doing here. By understanding this perspective, we'll be able to better understand an alternative perspective. So, what did we come up with? Building. It's about the individual buildings, is it? Okay, incomplete single modules. Yeah, or even like individual lessons is kind of one way of breaking this system down into parts in the individual subjects. Pupils, yeah, it's about pupils, about individual people, right? You know, we could actually learn together as teams, but quite often what you see in a classroom is the opposite, right? People sitting at their desks individually learning. So someone posted in the comments about collective intelligence. Well, that's the opposite from a lot of what we do in education, isn't it? We sit students down and we make them learn things individually as isolated units. So that's in some ways, we're not criticizing that, not saying that's a bad thing. There's obviously reasons why we do that. There are good reasons why we do that, but we're just looking at the world in a particular way here, or that's an expression of a particular way of looking at the world. So relationship between subject, not focus, input versus output, higher level questions and interest disregarded creates lack of motivation. Yes, so a lot of higher level questions are kind of not really dealt with in school. We break everything down into modules and units and subjects and so forth, and some broader questions may get thrown out in the in that exercise. Okay, what just happened to my mirror board? Let me see. Okay, all my stickies just disappeared. Here we are, back again. Very good. Okay, so school, individual pupils, disconnected, teacher, classroom, students, books, individuals, getting educated. Yeah, the individual elements of this system. That's what we're kind of listing here. Quite often you'll see when people use a reductionist approach to describe something, what they do is create a list of that thing. So if I ask you about what is your national government, well, they'll say, oh, it's the courts and it's the you know, the cabinets and ministries and so forth, and they'll just list all the individual parts, and that's quite a reductionist way of looking at the world. It's kind of a piecemeal way. Okay, regional curriculum, exams and assessment as individual components. Yep, that's what I was talking about there. Individual students, yeah, everything's focused on the individual. That's the unit of analysis here, right? And their kind of intelligence. It's not so much, we don't actually assess for anything at the aggregate level. How can teams work together? How well do people work together? Just educational material. No disciplinary approach, no interaction, no link between speakers and content. Yeah, okay, great. So, well done. That was looking at this educational system through this piecemeal view. Let's jump over here and flick to a different view of this system. What would it mean to look at this system in a holistic way? What would education, what would a holistic form or model of education look like? How would we go about educating students if we were trying to think about the whole in some sense? Let's take
just have one question before you proceed. So there's a question which says, where can systems thinking not be used?
When can systems thinking not be used?
Yeah.
Well, there's simple systems and there's complex systems, right? And if you're dealing with a simpler system, then reductionism can work fine. So you don't really need a lot of systems thinking if you're trying to understand a pile of stones, right? Analysis will work very well in that context. You just study all those stones and everything's fine. If you're dealing with something complex, an integrated whole system like the body, like an organization, like a financial system, you want to use a holistic perspective. So you'll often hear people talk about the relationship between complexity and systems thinking. Systems thinking helps us deal with complexity. So it means that when we have something complex, we really want to use systems thinking then. But if something's simple, pile of stones or yeah, a chair or something, you don't need a lot of systems thinking in that world. Does anyone have any comments about this exercise here? This trying to look at the whole system, the forest instead of the trees, what this education system might look like? Is this difficult? I think this switching between paradigms is quite difficult. Indeed, let's take a little look at some of the stuff we have here. So focus on interactions between all entities of the ecosystem. Yeah, so ecosystem, right? It's getting to the idea that there are many different parts to this education system. We kind of want to look at all of them and how they're interacting. Certainly a holistic perspective. So skills gap for future job markets. Yeah, it's looking at the relationship between this system and its function and its relationship to its broader economy and society and so forth. Embrace of lifelong learning, different concepts of school. Yeah, it's not dividing up kind of and putting education into a specific format that happens between 5 and 18 or 24. It's actually an ongoing thing over your full life cycle. Creativity, inspiration, synergy, solving future problems with educated people. Practice on real life problems. Yeah, so it's putting it into context, right? That's part of what we're saying here. That's part of the thing of systems thinking. A reductionist approach will actually isolate things and separate it from its context. And here we're putting it back into context, right? Solving future problems, practice on real life problems, so on and so forth. Collective intelligence, yeah, how a group of people actually work together instead of reducing down to the individual each time. So working in teams, how teams learn themselves as initial stage, and then how they pass it on to students and how this flows. Okay, any other ones here? Someone wants to flag up? No, knowledge flows, how knowledge flows from teachers to students, project-based learning, yeah, design-based education, building foundations for life cycle learning. Yeah, again, it's kind of putting it into context, right? So we know our educational system quite often kind of decontextualizes. It gets very separate from the rest of society and things going on out there. And here we're thinking about, what does it mean to put it back into context? What does it mean to think about the whole system, all the interacting parts, not just kind of this thing happening in the school, in the classroom, but maybe all the things that happen in that child or that person's life, right? The many different ways we can learn, and the ecosystem are different parts to this overall system and how they interact. And education is an ongoing process, not reducing it to one part of your life, but actually the whole kind of life cycle. And of course, this thing of collective intelligence and networks of people working together instead of the individual peer learning. Yep. Context learning. Great. Well done. So hopefully you're getting a little experience there of what we're talking about in terms of two different paradigms, two different ways of looking at education. And from those different ways of looking, we know, the whole thing here is that our way of looking at the world is going to kind of frame everything, right? Everything's going to follow from this. If we're looking at it in a reductionist way, we're going to kind of end up with the education system we have, right? That's kind of where it comes from. It's the idea that our paradigms, our mental models shape kind of everything that we do and how we go about building these systems and managing them and so forth. So if we actually looked at it in this different way, right, really thinking holistically about people's education and groups of people and over their full life cycle and the whole context within which we learn, we would then ultimately start to build different kind of educational systems and get different outcomes. Great. So if we're happy enough with that, let's move on to the next one here. That was about parts and the whole. It's a key aspect to systems thinking. Now we're going to look at the question of reductionism and emergence. So let's just take a little look at what we mean by emergence. Emergence is a central concept within systems theory as it describes a universal process of becoming or creation. A process whereby novel features and properties emerge when we put elementary parts together as they interact and self-organize to create new patterns of organization. Emergence, being a highly abstract concept, is literally everywhere. From the evolution of the universe to the formation of traffic jams, from the development of social movements to the flocking of birds, from the cooperation of trillions of cells within the human body to the formation of hurricanes and financial markets. These are all about how when individual parts come together and interact in synergistic ways, they form something greater than the sum of their parts, new patterns, new overall levels of organization. Emergence can be, it's a form of pattern formation that arises out of self-organization. Okay, so let's look at what we have here. This is, of course, the reductionist way is the opposite from emergence. It actually takes something complex, something emergent, and it breaks it down into individual parts and studies those parts, and then tries to understand the whole as just the sum of those individual parts, whereas emergence is saying actually things are emerging at the macro level, at the overall level that is greater than the sum of the parts, and we need to study it as a whole instead of dividing it all up into these individual parts. So let's here take the example of organizations, right? You could think about teams at work, how people work together and get stuff done in organizations. And let's grab our stickies again. We'll take a few more minutes and we'll think, what do organizations look like from this kind of reductionist paradigm? This even actually looks a bit like many of our organizational charts, right? So many of us will be familiar with this paradigm because we've mostly lived within these kinds of organizations, but let's post up our ideas here, but we get an idea of exercising this way of looking at the world in the context of organizations. It's about breaking the whole up into individual parts. Any questions, pop them in chat, or you can unmute yourself actually if you want to ask anything or any comments. Okay, let's take a look at what we've found here. Thinking about organizations in this reductionist paradigm. Hierarchical, centralized. Yeah, I mean, when we break things down like this, and then we have to put them back together again some way, and often that ends up in a hierarchical structure like that. We kind of add the parts up and combine them into larger ones like this in an additive way. And it takes this hierarchical form like that, which is actually quite different to when we take this emergent approach. Okay, so the opposite of open, overt interrelations. Okay, tyranny of the managers, yeah, lack of feedback, reduction in information across levels, yeah, control focused over creativity, yeah, because these parts are kind of being managed in a top-down fashion here. Okay, hierarchy, titles that represent hierarchy, blue collar and white collar, yeah, input through output, kind of linear conception. We'll talk about that in a minute. Flow of information and decision-making mediated by social power and structure. Standardized, tightly controlled. No guiding star to make the world a better place. Focus on the present. High in hierarchy means competent. Traditional strategic planning and values outcome and certainty. Concept of leadership has all the answers. Savior. Communication only within the silos. Yeah. So it breaks things down. When you break things down, what happens? We end up with all these silos here that creates certain structure, ownership, titles, policy, targets, business units, standardization of processes. Okay, top-down communications, specialization departments. Great. Well done. And again, we know that's kind of what our world looks like, right? If you looked at the organizational structure for an enterprise or a government or a university, it would look something like this, and it's very reflective of this reductionist way of looking at the world. But we know other ways of organizing are also possible. And they may be reflective of a different kind of world view, an idea that maybe we don't need to break everything down. Maybe some things actually emerge in a bottom-up fashion. When we put things together in particular ways, we're going to get the emergence of patterns and structure at the higher level. So I noted down below many examples of that. Hurricanes, traffic jams. Traffic jams are just individual cars, everybody kind of doing their own thing, but when they interact, they start to produce emergent outcomes. The traffic jam is an emergent outcome of many parts interacting. We had other ones down here. I talked about water and so on. The flocking of birds, we've probably seen that, right? Those starlings flocking and the way they create those patterns. It's an example of emergent pattern. No one's in control, right? Doesn't look like this over here at all. It looks a bit like this. They're interacting locally, something's emerging. So what would that look like in the context of organizations? This emergent thinking. How do small parts come together in a bottom-up way to form new emergent patterns? Let's take a couple of minutes to do that. Please.
We just have 2 questions before we start.
Yep.
So the first one is about how different is the from reductionism when compared with pessimal thinking, and
with what thinking?
Pessimal thinking, piecemeal thinking.
Piecemeal thinking. How different is reductionism from piecemeal thinking?
Yeah, and just
okay,
sorry, just as a sub.
Oh yeah, go.
And what are they each asking us to notice?
Okay, yeah, good question. So in a sense, all of these here are the same, right? They're all a paradigm called analytical reductionism. So they're very similar. What each is emphasizing, this here is the idea that we're looking at the world in this fractured individual parts way. And here it's emphasizing that when we go about understanding things, we do a process of breaking those things down into parts. And that's the kind of process we go through for understanding things. So it's slightly different, but at the end of the day, all of these are very similar. Like a linear way of looking at the world is the same as an analytical way and so forth. It's just emphasizing slightly different things, different stream, those individual parts, analyzing those parts and breaking the whole thing down.
And we have another question. It says that in what ways do a focus on addressing root causes counter systems thinking?
In what ways does focusing on root causes count as systems thinking?
Yeah.
It's a tricky term, root causes. We've had many discussions about that actually in our community, because root causes can very easily be an expression of this way of thinking, cause, as the name implies, cause and effect, which can end up a very linear way. We're drilling, and again, this can be a reductionist way, because we say we're drilling down to find that root cause, that thing down there that is the cause of all these other things. So it can very easily be an expression of a reductionist way of looking at the world. But at the same time, there's certain aspects that represent systems thinking. I personally avoid that term. But we know, there's terms around leverage points and so forth. So it does play in there. In the sense of systems thinking, it's about how can we remove just looking at individual parts, looking at the iceberg model, if you know it, remove looking at events and go down the iceberg until we get to the mental models, the things that are really shaping the outcomes here. It's a bit of a tricky term. It's quite a discussion in our community, actually, whether root causes is really a good term to use, because it can be a bit reductionist. Okay, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump in. Feel free to stay posting up. So self-governing projects. Yeah, so we have fewer stickies here. It's a little bit of a difficult question, isn't it, right? We have lots of stickies over here. Often it's not too difficult to answer what the world looks like in that way. What does it look like in this way can sometimes be a bit trickier, a little bit difficult to be a system. This requires systems thinking. So self-governing projects. Open group boundaries, yeah. Closed-minded teams and departments, tragedy of the commons, transdisciplinary interactions, people, processes, technology, and data, guided autonomy, organizational culture. So people are talking a bit about kind of setting the context or the guides within which this self-organization might take place. Culture could be part of that. Psychological safety, flexible roles and responsibility. Generative image. Inclusive culture, staff, well-being, collaboration. Value both mind and body knowledge. Multidisciplinary teams, yeah. It's quite different to what goes on over here. Here we separate out all these different teams and departments. Here we might put them all together so that we can get synergies between them. And see what happens when we do that. Synthesis, yeah. Fluidity, networks, serendipity, yeah, definitely part of emergence. We don't know what's going to happen over here. When we put things together in novel ways, in dynamic ways, we don't really know what's going to emerge. Certain level of uncertainty and so forth. Okay, let's stay going for the sake of time. Well done there. We were thinking about the difference between reductionism and emergence, which is really the difference between breaking things down and putting things together, right? Analysis is breaking things down. Synthesis is this emergent thing, we put them together. Like those, we talked about water, right? Hydrogen and oxygen, we put them together and something new is emerging. And that's, all complex phenomena have that feature, right? When we put the people in a family together, we get a dynamic going that's different from just the individual people in isolation. When we put an organization, when we put a school of fish, when we put many things together, complex phenomena, complex adaptive systems, they have this emergent feature. So that's that. That was our second canvas here. We're learning about the systems thinking canvas. We're looking at it along 4 dimensions. Firstly, the whole and the parts, and then we just now did reductionism and emergence. And now we're going to look at actually this one over here, linear and nonlinear thinking. So maybe you've heard of these ideas. Maybe you know that linear thinking is this reductionist way of looking at the world. It's a cause and effect way. And we're asking, what does the world look like when we take that perspective? You can see it here. It's A causes B. And it's good for a lot of simple problems. For example, if I go to my dentist, have a problem with my tooth, and I go to my dentist and he analyzes the problem and he says, well, you've got some bacteria there. That's the cause of your problem. Very simple. And he's an expert. He knows this. He goes and fixes the problem. And there we go. Get a filling and all very good. Relatively simple problem. But there's another kind of way of looking at the world. There's another dynamic, particularly in complex systems. It's this cyclical feedback, right? One thing affects another, and then it just doesn't just stop there. It actually kind of feeds back and affects the first. So a good maybe example of this is our thinking around economic development. Think about GDP. It's our industrial kind of conception of economic development is that our economy can just keep on getting bigger and our GDP can just keep on growing. And that's just going to keep on happening forever. And that's a very linear kind of cause and effect. It's not considering the context and it's not considering the feedback effect of that, right? We now know, well, we can't keep on growing our economy forever because what happens when it grows, it affects the environment and that feeds back to affect us again. Right, so there's actually this cyclical thing going on there, and we need to understand that. So that's a systems thinking way of looking at the world. We're always looking at those feedback loops. This is an analytical way. So let's take this example here of an ecosystem and put on our reductionist goggles on the left-hand side here and think about what does this look like from a reductionist linear kind of conception of it. One thing causes another, and that's how we look at it. We try to describe everything as just these cause and effect kind of mechanistic view. Let's jump in there and post up some ideas for the next couple of minutes. Yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments on this activity? It's all making sense to everyone what we're doing here, this linear way of looking at things. In the context of ecosystems we're looking at here. So excess fertility, runoff, algae blooms, inchbee, hierarchy of animals. So maybe we've seen that graphic, right, of the kind of pyramid with humans at the top and all the animals below them. That would be a kind of linear way of looking at it, a kind of reductionist way of looking at us in relation to our ecosystem, whereas this feedback one might be we're part of that system, right? It's affecting us and we're affecting it in a constant kind of feedback dynamic, cyclical feedback dynamic. Okay, food chains, food waste, fast fashion, okay. Pollutants, kill life, yep. Direct solutions for problems. If this, then that, solution planning. Yeah, but waste is an interesting one. It's like we're just taking a material. We know that in ecosystems, there isn't really such a thing as waste, is there, right? It's all this kind of feedback loop. Everything gets recycled and reused in some way, but the way we've engineered our world is we have these materials that don't integrate with the natural environment and we don't want them, this wasted plastic and so forth, and we just push it out and it sits there. It's kind of a dead end. That's a result of a linear way of looking at the world, a kind of dead end effect, like waste. Ego thinking, yeah. we're at the center of this world and we can do things to the natural environment and it won't necessarily kind of come back to us over time. Okay, so direct solutions for problems, reintroduced to restore original state. Low markets are a sign of not enough time spent on study. Okay, it's always someone's fault. Pollutants kill life. Okay, very good. Let's look at what it would mean, this cyclical view, this feedback, where we're seeing how one thing causes another, but then that may feedback. It may not be a direct feedback, right? It might take time to feedback. It might cycle through a number of different elements. Please grab your stickies and post there to look at this system, the ecosystem, through this perspective. Hopefully, you know, as we're doing this, our exercise here is not to actually create an output. We're trying to learn about this canvas and how to use it and how it works and so forth. So hopefully you're keeping a kind of meta thinking about how this is working as you go through. Okay, let's take a little flick through these. So this cyclical, this feedback way of looking at ecosystems, experiment, de-risk, evolve. Yeah, evolution is an example of this feedback dynamic, a creature interacting with its environment, those interactions feeding back to inform the next iteration of that population. There's a dynamic, it's kind of an adaptive process, right? All kind of adaptive systems are going to be like this, with this information feedback system going on. So market, trade, adaptation to environment. Yeah, dancing. Yeah, very much like dancing, isn't it? You know, dancing is this constant interaction, this constant adaptation between two actors in a very dynamic fashion. So we can see also that this is a dynamic thing, isn't it? This is quite a static thing. Like one thing happens, one thing affects another. It's like hitting a ball or something, and then it's kind of over. This can be like a dynamic cyclical feedback, like dancing is a good example. So secondhand, balancing feedback loops, yeah, cooperation, organic learning, reuse, not human friendly, difficult to model, shape and act. Continuous feedback and adjustment of design. Yeah, it's kind of the way we like our systems to be, wouldn't it? Organizations and so forth. They're able to evolve, they're able to adapt, they're able to respond to the context that they're in, and they mean these feedback. And it's a way of looking at the world, right? That's what we're talking about here, ways of looking at the world. And this is certainly one. You could choose to focus on this way of looking at the world, or you can choose to focus on this way of looking at the world in any context, right? This could be anything we're talking about. That's the nature of paradigms, right? We can apply them to any context we go in. So circular economy, yep, for sure. Biomimicry, composting, yep. Self-regulation, there is a self-regulation involved in that, isn't there? This system is going to be self-balancing. You know, if this was our economy, and it really had that proper information feedback loop about its effect to the natural environment, feeding back to it and adapting and adjusting, we would be in a much more sustainable world, much more viable world than the one we're in, which is quite a linear relationship between economy and environment. We think we can just kind of push things out there and they won't come back. Okay, so that's thinking about linear versus non-linear kind of views of the world. Hopefully that's helped to illustrate one dimension to systems thinking, is this feedback view of the world. Okay, so finally here we just have 10 minutes left, so we're going to go through this quite quickly. It's the difference between connected, someone mentioned it already, a kind of relational way of looking at things, how things are interrelated and connected, versus the reductionist approach. We talked about reduction and breaking things down. Well, part of breaking things down is separating them out, right? So you kind of disconnect them. Talk about silos and so forth. That's what silos are, kind of separations in organizations. So, and all the time, it's not saying one thing is good and one thing is bad, right? We know we need both of these. Both of these are needed, and in different contexts, in different relationships, different amounts in different contexts, depending if the thing's complex or if it's simple or what we're dealing with. So please, we'll talk about cities here. We just have a bit of time, so we'll go quite quickly. What does it look like to look at this city in a kind of disconnected thinking, isolated, disconnected view of the system?
We just have one more question. Yes?
Yep.
So the question says, so we'll be looking at the order of different ways of thinking. So the holistic, the reduction, emergence, linear, non-linear, and the fourth one is the run right now, connected, disconnect. So when someone's actually working on a real project, is this the order to be followed? Or how do you apply them to your life challenges?
Oh, okay. So the question is, if we're applying this thinking in a project, should we follow this kind of sequence, or is there? Okay.
That's the first part of the question, and the second part also to it, which says, how do you apply them to your life challenges? Probably that's the continuation to the.
Okay, so is there a particular sequence? No, not necessarily, I wouldn't say. I would be inclined to do it this way. I think this reductionism, and well, I think as we had noted, this aspect of whole versus parts, we know is very foundational to systems thinking. So I'd maybe be inclined to start here and then move to this more relational aspect to it, but I wouldn't say there's really a particular way of doing it. Yeah, you could choose your own. The second one was, how do we apply this to a real world context, was it? Kind of depends on the context. Yeah, I mean, here we're trying to, ultimately what we're trying to do is derive new insights, new ways of looking at things, right? So it obviously depends what you're doing, right? If we take this example we're at here, cities, right? So you might be developing a city, a smart city. You might be developing a whole new city in Saudi Arabia or somewhere, right? And you could adopt a kind of reductionist approach to the way we have to our cities. Right, we lay them out in grids and blocks and so forth. If you look at it from a distance, it looks like a big grid and all these squares, and that's very much a kind of reductionist paradigm. Or you could start thinking about, right, what are the processes taking place in this city, and how can we interconnect things to enable those processes? For example, there might be ecological processes going on in this city. How do we create little ecological corridors so that maybe creatures can run around and we can have ecological processes going on in our city? Instead of dividing, you know, we have a city block here or we have a park block here and another block over there of the park. How can we actually interconnect all of that so that, you know, people could travel all the way through the city in the park, walk all the way through the city? So that's thinking about the city in terms of the processes that are taking place. And it's just one example. There are many others I could give. Okay, quickly. So I lost track of time there, right? Questions or these post-its? We're looking at a divided way of, this separated way of looking at the world. So parks, institutions, we're talking about cities here, visitors, citizens, bad public transport. Okay, yes, I think we all know a bit about that on many of us. So economic status, shops, buildings, pollutions, lack of green space, non-diverse communities. So it's actually a lot of what we have done. If you think about how we design cities, it's we separated everything out. We actually, if you look, we have financial centers here, we have commercial centers there, we have residential centers there, and we have, you know, big parking lots over there and parks over there. And then you've got to drive a long way to go from one to the other. Now we're starting to think about a 15-minute city, or things where we start interconnecting all these parts into little communities, you know, where you have everything. You have living, you have residential, you have work, you have your commercial center, all there in one place. It's all interconnected, integrated, and so forth. That's another way. Let's just complete this little exercise here. What's an interconnected way of looking at a city? What's it like looking at the world from this lens? We'll just take a couple of minutes before we finish up.
Just we have two more questions. Should we take them now or later?
Yeah, go for it now. Yeah.
Okay, the first one is how do you show the interconnections between the elements of the system and the feedback loops in the canvas?
How do you show them?
How do you show the interconnection between elements of the system and the feedback loops in the canvas?
Yeah, so that kind of gets to systems mapping. Maybe you've heard of that. We do diagrams, maps, where we think about the elements and the interrelationships between them. And you can do that in many ways. You could do it here on a mirror board. You post up your stickies, which are individual elements, and then you start drawing out the relationships between them. And then you start looking at, well, what are the feedback loops going on here? As mentioned, they don't have to be, you know, just very direct ones. They can be mediated through a number of different nodes, but that's exactly what we're doing in systems mapping. So if you looked into systems mapping, that's a way of diagramming and modeling and representing relationships and feedback loops.
Okay, and the other one is, would true holistic thinking include both reductionist and holistic thinking?
Yeah, so very important, very important. Whole ultimately means everything, right? So it should include the parts and the relationships and the whole. And you totally need both these ways of looking at the world. If we go back and read the guide I showed you at the beginning, it will kind of explain the importance of balancing both ways of looking at the world. So we need both for sure.
Okay.
Great.
We just got a third question.
Yep.
Do you want to take that? Okay. So the question is, what is the difference between non-linear thinking and connected thinking?
Yeah, so connected thinking is about just the relationships, that there are relationships and you're looking at those relationships. Non-linear thinking is specifically focusing on the feedback loops, right? The fact that one thing affects another and then that feeds back again to affect the first. And then also the question of what happens if you have that relationship over time? This affects that, this creates more of that, and this feeds back to create more of the first. You get a non-linear exponential change over time. So this is non-linear dynamics and so forth. And that's a way of looking at the world in terms of these circles and these feedback loops. The relational thinking is a more basic thing. You're looking at patterns of connections. You're looking at networks. You're thinking about the relationship between things. When you think of a family, you don't think about think about the individual people in that family and study their age and, you know, their behavior. You think about how do they relate to each other. So it's a very foundational way of, you know, again, a paradigm, right, of looking at the world. Okay, so we have come to the end of our time. Just to take a look at this connected view of the world. Multifunctional buildings, yes. Right, it's not separating out the functions into different parts. You're putting them all together and interconnecting them and asking about how to get synergies and maybe feedback loops and so forth. Internet of Things, yeah, everything's going to get connected. Innovation, services. Yeah, services are connections across different devices and systems and products and so forth. Central transportation planning, community gardens. Yeah, connecting a community, right? The garden. Where do citizens meet? Yeah, that's good. That's an interesting question, actually. Do we ask that question? Quite often we say, okay, we need a fancy plaza here, or we need a fancy whatever that there. Do we actually ask the question of where do people meet and how do they connect and when do they connect and so forth? That's that'd be a relational way of looking at the world, instead of just saying we need a park here and it's got to have these things and it's got to have those things. It's actually, how are people connecting? Okay, travel path planning, shared private transport. How do we share public space? Integrated land usage, bikes or walk everywhere, all services nearby. Yeah, thinking about connectivity. How connected are people to the things nearby to them? Community hubs for people working remotely. Great, interesting that one. Sub-city clusters serving all citizen needs. Wow, quite impressive. You seem to be a bunch of urban planners or architects or something. I like these ideas. Multifunctional buildings, yeah, great. Nest cities, shared pipe, yeah, great. Looks good. Create an environment worth living in. Okay, so that was that. We've come to the end. I hope this was useful. We were looking at the systems thinking canvas, a way to help people, yourself, if you're maybe a researcher thinking about something, or maybe you're an innovator or a designer, you've got a complex problem, you're trying to shift your thinking about that, or maybe you're working with a teacher, you're working with students and you're trying to help them think in a new way. This could be a benefit to you. And as mentioned, you'll find the canvas on our website. You just click there and it'll take you to it. And this guide will explain a lot of the stuff I was talking about is kind of taken from this guide, which is the ideas behind the canvas. You shouldn't jump into the canvas until you understand a bit the ideas first. Okay, so that's that. Thank you all for joining. It was a short session.
A question last. I'm just going to read it out, but John, let me know if it's not got it right. So it says that connected, like the connections form in loops. Is it the difference between linear and systems?
The connections form loops. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, if you have just one kind of connection going in one direction, then it can end up very linear. And if you have a cyclical one, that's one aspect, right, of the difference. As we've seen here, right, we've got 4 different aspects, and maybe there are others. We're not saying this is exhaustive or it's the only way of presenting systems thinking. We're just saying that these are different aspects to it that you could consider to help people think in a new way. Yeah. Okay, great. Maybe we should make these sessions an hour and a half long because we always seem to be a bit rushed and run out of time. So maybe next time we'll extend it a bit. But we've come to the end of our time today. I'll just say upcoming next event is a learning session. I believe that is around the beginning of next month, a couple of weeks away. 3 Horizons model. We'll be working on a canvas again there. Also, if you want to keep up to date with the Hub, we have our LinkedIn page here. We also have our community channel here. And on our YouTube channel, we post all our videos or events and so forth. And this one will be there also. So that's that, people. Thank you very much for joining. And I look forward to seeing you again at a future date. Where we'll maybe create a bit more space for ourselves and won't be so rushed, but it was great having this opportunity. I'll talk to you all soon.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.